seasonal. And these that are all seasonal are the deliverables you do around the sectors that you should be working around. Why am I saying this? If you look at the budget alternative that has been done by IPF, and I commend Jiri for even the demeanor at which you highlighted the issues. If you look at it, and I want to be very frank, you have to make a choice as a country between managing politics and delivering. What am I trying to say? There is no better way of showing what you want to do other than through the budget allocations. Now, if what you want to achieve, for example, is roads, if what we want to achieve as a country is healthcare, if what we want to achieve is in education, then just follow the budget. Go check how much has been allocated. And therefore that will speak more than the words. Now, what I've seen, the state, the architecture of the state, beyond the doing, there is also the people management side. The people management side, of course, is done through that sector that was criticized by Bernard. That sector that has, of course, GJRO, and also there is the administration. I don't want to say more, just scrutinize the budget. Because, for example, if you look at the supplementary budget we just did, there was a variation around administration again of over 10 billion shillings to one specific institution. Why am I saying these things? The orientation of a country, you need to define, we need to define. The orientation around the circumstances in Kenya now are the real issues around security and management of people, or is it in other areas, for example, like roads and other deliverables? You just need to look at the budget, you can tell. Why am I saying so? If, for example, you increase the budget, let me use interior, for example, and you see a significant increment, and in that year there is no recruitment that is happening, and if you go to the budget of the development of that specific ministry, there is no increment that is notable, therefore that money is going into recurrent, then you ask yourself, this money that is going into recurrent in sectors that are by law not as transparent as others, then you need to make your deduction around there. And I'm speaking that because I know I'm talking to experts. You scrutinize. So when the money is going here, if it's, for example, buying equipment that are security related, fine, which are they? But if it's going to recurrent, what is recurrent in that sector? And up to what length can you question that recurrent as a Kenyan? Up to what length can you question that expenditure as a journalist, for example? You'll get many answers from that. And I hope I am speaking. The other thing, because many times we confuse, budget making process is not just about June or whichever other date that the minister reads highlights. It starts pretty earlier. It starts many months before that date. And it goes all the way into oversight. And therefore, even IPF, I challenge you, some of the questions we are asking, I challenge you to also take it up. Because even, for example, if you look at KPIs, you look at the allocations, that's not the head of budget. Even what the Auditor General does is not the head of the budget. There is now what PAC and PIC in Parliament, therefore, analyzes. I challenge you to also go the full length so that we also check at the outcome at the end of the tunnel. It starts from way early, but it also ends way after June. Let's be able to check also the after implementation. If we say we have built a classroom, for example, can you verify through sampling those kind of projects? So it starts early. And just for understanding, we divide the state into 10 sectors. And those 10 sectors incorporate several ministries. So when you see, for example, those sectors that are 10, all the ministries are condensed, or all government departments are condensed, including sagas, into those 10 sectors. The other thing I just want to highlight is that my experience as chairman of budget is not the one we read. This is the hard truth. The budget of Kenya is called exchequer. The budget is not the one we read. The one we read remains there. When you have a country where there is a discrepancy between what you budget for and how much you can raise as revenue. So what we budget for is not the budget. What you fund is the budget. When you are in a household budget and you have what you want to achieve, you want to build a house in Githurai, you want to build your rural home, you want to buy a car, that is what is the budget. Then after that, those are aspirations. What can you fund out of your revenue? That is the real budget. So the things that I was seeing some semantics about absorption. That word called absorption, you need to actually juxtapose it from absorption to not funded. Those nice words about absorption and absorption, it basically means more than 95% that those programs were actually not funded by the close of the financial year. Those words around absorption, the problem is that the responsibility is left with the accounting officer, the responsibility to explain. But the overarching ministry, which is the National Treasury, then is left with no responsibility. If you sit here and you're talking about an absorption, for example, in the Department of Basic Education, like the classrooms I saw in laboratories, if there is a CFO or the PS for basic education, they seem like the ones carrying the burden, that you didn't absorb the money yet it was budgeted. That is not the truth. The truth is that that program or those projects were actually not funded. So that I have seen part of managing our country's economics is communicating things as they are, so that people's expectations are aligned to what can be delivered and are aligned to what is possible. There are just a few other things I want to highlight. One is the budget. The budget that we know in terms of the expenditure side. If you could have followed the presentation here, BPS level 4.3 trillion. Let me use the one that has been implemented, because, and you forgive me for this because I've been there. The real budget is the one that has been implemented, not the one you want not the aspirations of the next financial year. And that comes in handy at the close of the financial year, when you realize there is a lot of gap in terms of revenue. Now let me actually use the one that has partly been implemented for this current financial year. And let me use the one before revision, before the second supplementary. You're talking about a budget of 3.8 trillion. I want you to see what it is that we budget for. Kenya has two very stagnant and solid polars in budget making. One is the side of discretionary, the other one is non-discretionary. As the institutions of the state continue to solidify, what usually happens is that the role of a leader gets diminished by the day. The role of budget making organs gets diminished the more institutions of governance continue to solidify. Let me try to explain this. In a country like Kenya that is doing fairly well in terms of having enough institutions around governance, that continues to decimate the role of decision making in resource allocation. Why? Majority of the huge proportion of our budget is actually non-discretionary. There is nothing you can do about it. So you are sitting there as the leader, championing or leading budget making, but up to what point can you exercise your mind? This is the reason. 3.8 trillion is there as your budget. You read it, is an astronomical figure, and it projects even growth in expenditure, etc. All those good semantics we put in the budget making process. But out of 3.8 trillion, you remove 1.25 to 1.3 trillion as something called consolidated fund service. I'm not using BPS, I'm using this current financial year. Out of that 1.25 trillion, over 1.08 trillion is money you're going to pay interest rates for debts. 1.008 trillion. It will be more next financial year. Now, there is nothing you can do about that. There is also nothing you can do about funding constitutional bodies and commissions, and there is nothing you can do about pension. All those falls under CFS. So you budget 1.2 thereabout trillion, there is nothing you can do about it. Then come to salaries of civil servants. Salaries of civil servants in Kenya is in the range of 600 to 700 in the few years around here now, 600 to 700 billion Kenya shillings. There is also nothing you can do about that. There is a constitutional requirement of funding counties to a tune of 380 billion that time, this financial year, actually without carryovers. Once you put carryovers, it is over 400 billion. There is nothing you can do about that also. So what happens then? We end up with a kitty we call development budget of around 700 billion, which over the years, as I said when I was starting, is just an aspiration. It is not a budget. It is an aspiration. Because you budget 700 billion, by the close of the financial year, you are less in revenue collection by 300 billion. You can't cut payment of interest rate. Neither can you cut any part of CFS. You can't cut salaries. There is a part you can't cut, for example, FPE. Part of recurrent, for example, is free basic education. There is nothing you can do about that. So what usually happens? When Treasury receives money, revenue, they fund all those things, other things as priority. The last one to be funded is development. So in that development then, it is the one that takes the hit and the cut when there is a downsize or a downgrade in revenue collection. So the room to exercise the authority of budget making process continues to be decimated. For me, in one way, it's a good thing, especially in regards to what this money goes into doing. But of course, as I wind up, I'll talk more about also the revenue side. Nachukua a few points here and there. I'm talking broadly, so please don't get lost in the mix. I'm just trying to be broad and general. This financial year, as you do the alternative budget, this and next, you'll likely see a lot of enhancement in GJ law, because maybe 1 year after today, or even months after today, we are likely to see a lot of activities around IEBC. It is a huge budget expectation there, because we are talking about around 60 billion Kenya shillings that must go into the instruments of democracy, into making sure you have a credible election in the year of election, which is not very far from today. Now, why have I picked just the IEBC? Even with the challenges that there are in terms of funding the current budget, the budget we are likely to give IEBC during the electioneering period is actually more than the entire budget we give to the road sector in Kenya when you talk about development funded by GOK. So I want you to start exercising your mind around your expectations then. I have talked about non-discretionaries you can't do anything about. There is now another non-discretionary called IBC that will take approximately 60 billion. So what is that doing? It continues to shrink what you may call political development. As an MP, as a politician, you may talk about all the other things. Before you talk about roads and water, you have not yet said anything about development. Because the people's expectation in terms of Kenya is around those areas. Let me say something about debt. If there is one threat that we face as a country today, it is debt. And I don't think we are taking the seriousness of this matter the way it should. And I also don't think those who are responsible are communicating enough about the problem we have about debt. When you are in a hole, there are many ways you can get out of that hole. You can get a ladder. You can get somebody to pull you from it. There are many ways. One of the ways you cannot get out of the hole is to continue digging that hole. You know, I just want you to reflect on the figures that we are projected here. You tell me whether Kenya continues to get out of the hole or to dig the hole further. And I think in terms of debt management, we have a lot of work to do as a country. And the government also has a lot of work to do around debt management. If you track debt from year 2003, especially during President Kibaki's time, he took up the country when the debt was around 600 billion shillings. By the time he left, it was around 1.8 trillion. But I want you to see the other side of it. When President Kibaki came in, revenue collection in Kenya was 200 billion. Can you just imagine how small a country we were? We were collecting only 200 billion in ordinary revenue. When President Kibaki left, that figure was around or close to 1 trillion Kenya shillings. So if you look at the debt growth, the debt grew from 600 to 1.8 trillion. That's around maybe 200% over and above. But look at the revenue collection. The revenue collection, with the growth was like double that of debt accumulation. And I want to say, because figures don't lie, you realize that the accolades given to President Mwai Kibaki, he actually deserves more. Because now we have comparisons to do. You know, when it was just President Kibaki's reign, there was no comparative analysis to do. Now he left in 2013. We can now do comparative analysis from then. And clearly you can see Kenya has never had a more prudent president than President Mwai Kibaki. And it is the same time we had very revolutionary expenditure lines like basic education funding and all the others that even beyond being good in terms of growth of the economy, they also are social investments because they enhance an egalitarian society. All of us here in this hall, I can bet over 80% will not be in this hall were it not for the reforms around education during that time or regime of President Mwai Kibaki. Why am I talking about that in this kind of standness? We are now talking about 10 trillion to 11 trillion depending on where the currency is, because 50% is denominated by a currency, not other currencies, not ours. Now, if you check our debt to GDP levels, and I want to agree with Bernard, this is what happens when you are making a budget. You have to address the issues in your country. But I have also seen we are not as sovereign as we purport to be. Developing countries are not as sovereign as it appears. Because when you are doing revenue raising measures, for example, some of those things are conditions from people you want to borrow money from. Without mentioning the exact ones, I can see in your faces you already know them. So, are we together? Ama nipuguza hii maneno ya economics ya kiasi. I'm looking for words for you to capture this point properly. I'm talking about debt. If you look at our debt level, 10 to 11 trillion, and I'm trying to solidify the point that was said earlier, you'll be given a condition about debt to GDP ratio. You'll also be given a condition around fiscal deficit to GDP ratio. If you notice there, GDP is cutting across both two parameters. So what do authorities do? Because the target is on a percentage. If I do 2 out of 10, 2 out of 10 is what? 2 over 10 is 20. 2 over 10. 2 divided by 10. What's that? 20%. Very well. What about when I do 2 out of 20? 10%. What have I changed? Have I changed? Is the 2 constant? What have I changed? What if my obligation was to lower the percentage? What do I need to do around the denominator? Now, ask yourself this. You report in the same government documents, the Kenyan GDP grew by 4.something%. That goes in the record. The same record shows the GDP moved from 16 trillion to 18 trillion. What is that percent? Can somebody do 16 out of 18? I mean, do the math. When GDP moves from 16 to 18, what percentage is that? That is 2 out of 16. 12.5. Okay, they will argue one is real, the other one is nominal. You can even discount inflation out of it. So I want you to see, so that even as you work around the figures you work on as IPF and also the fourth estate, you are able to get the reality by yourself. Because if the economy has grown by 10%, then it should reflect also on the GDP side, which you calculate in, or you used to calculate the other parameters, but should also be the one reported by the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics and all the other government bodies. I hope I'm making sense. You don't need anyone to tell you the economy of Kenya grew by what percent. You can calculate it by yourself in nominal terms and in real terms, because you have all the parameters from public institutions. So the problem around our debt is that when we inflate our denominator, we continue to show like the economy grew with the purpose of having a leg room of borrowing more. The problem is that you cannot cheat figures for too long. It catches up with you, and especially when it is time for repayment. Debt management is everything else. It catches you around repayment. Now, we are spending over 1 trillion Kenya shillings in paying our interest rates. Over 1 trillion Kenya shillings. Now, whether you inflate GDP or you condense it, that is actual money that actually have to be paid. That is where it catches you. Because you may come and say, you know, our fiscal deficit to GDP ratio is 5% or the next, or the other figure. That's fine, it goes to the books. It will catch up with you when it's time for repayment. The other things I want you to, I'm just provoking your mind so that you go research further. I saw headlines in our newspapers the other day in jubilation that we have done a very good thing, because in that year of 20, I think last year or thereabout, we were able to repay our Eurobond. And the people in this hall, because I can see you are able to dig deeper. You talk about in jubilation of having been able to pay the Eurobond of 2014. And it comes out as headline as a jubilation for the country. Now this is the reality. The reality is that you retire a debt of 6.8% with a debt of 10.3%, and then you clap and you want the whole country to be closed for people to celebrate. I'm provoking all of us here. I mean, Kenya is for all of us, and we need to speak these things as clearly as they ought. You cannot go and take a loan from Shylock, you pay a bank, and then you go home, and people should celebrate you for taking a loan with an interest of 20% to pay the one you had that you are paying 12%. Those are the things that will catch up with this country very soon. And by the way, with all honesty, if we do not become more prudent in the several months to come, we are likely to have a very big problem with our debt. Why? If in our revenue collection, over 40% is going into interest rate alone of debt obligations, what are we talking about? The other thing I want us to reflect on around debt, and the reason why this, and I'm challenging even those who are responsible in government to speak about it clearly, because part of this communication is important. You collect revenues of around 2.4 trillion shillings. You use over 1.2 trillion in paying interest rates of debt incurred. So that's 50% that you can do nothing about. Basically what we are doing as a country, the money we are borrowing in terms of PFM Act, you should be borrowing for development alone. But even by doing the math, even with a pencil, if we take our revenue collection, you remove CFS, you remove salaries, you're already in red. It means the money we borrow